Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Thanks for joining. My name is Felina Fleck. I'm the assistant director of the Graduate International Programs Office here at University of San Diego. We're so thankful for Dr. Brooks to donate his time and expertise to hold a session in our name. We're excited to have everyone here. Please feel free to turn on your camera. That way we can have a more interactive discussion. And that way we have the feeling we're here with a lot of people and not just our screens. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm here with Dr. Justin Brooks, the program director of our online LLM programs. He practiced criminal defense in his previous life to becoming part of our university here. And he practiced in Washington, D.C., Michigan, Illinois, and California. Here in California, he is the founding director of the California Innocence Project. And under his direction, they have freed 40 innocent people from wrongful conviction, including former NFL player Brian Banks, which you might have heard of his case. He is also the author of the only legal case book devoted to wrongful convictions and his personal book of You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. We are so happy to have you here, Dr. Brooks. Please introduce yourself any further, anything else I forgot, and we're excited to learn from you.
No, thank you so much, Felina. That's plenty about me. Today I want to talk about wrongful convictions and the causes of wrongful convictions and what I've learned over the last now 35 years litigating as a criminal defense attorney and litigating wrongful conviction cases. And to give a framework to it, I do want to talk about the book that Felina talked about for a minute. My book, You Might Go to Innocent Even Though You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. Because that book, the whole idea behind that book was that a publisher came to me and said, reflect back on your decades of work and think about what are the main causes of wrongful conviction? What are the reasons that your clients went to prison? And so I structured the whole book around that. It's 10 chapters that look at the top 10 causes of wrongful convictions. And I didn't start my career as a wrongful conviction attorney or an innocent attorney. In fact, most of my clients were guilty. I started as a traditional criminal defense attorney, representing whatever cases came my way and trying to make sure my clients got fair trials and make sure my clients got appropriate sentences and that everyone did their job. But one day, my world was sort of rocked when I heard about a case involving this young woman, Marilyn Malero. At that time, I was teaching law school in Michigan, and I'd kind of, for about 6 months, I hadn't been doing much criminal defense work. I got seduced by academia and was mostly teaching classes. But I read about this young woman, and this article says that she's sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And remember reading the sentence a few times and thinking, how is it possible that someone gets sentenced to death on a plea bargain? The whole idea of a plea bargain is you negotiate to get a lesser sentence in exchange for entering a guilty plea. And the impact of entering a guilty plea means that you're now not going to have a trial. You're going to lose most of your appellate rights. And basically, you're at the end of the road. And so I couldn't understand why anyone would do that in exchange for the death penalty, which would have been the worst punishment she would have gotten if she'd gone through a trial, got convicted, gone through a death hearing, got sentenced to death. That sentence was upheld on appeal. She would have had all that due process and all those opportunities not to get the death penalty. So I set up a meeting with her in Illinois. I was living in East Lansing, Michigan. And I drove hundreds of miles down to Southern Illinois to meet with her on death row. She was scheduled to be executed. And I said to her, what happened? And she said her lawyer told her to plead guilty. And I said, and he did that without any deal of a lesser sentence? No, they just pled me guilty And then we went to the hearing. I got sentenced to death. And then she said an amazing thing. She said, and I'm innocent. So I said, you're innocent and you pled guilty and now you're getting the death penalty? And she said, yeah. And so I went back to the law school where I was teaching, and I had a big classroom of first year law students. And I said, who wants to help me out on this case? And it's this young woman, 21 years old, kid, sentenced to death without a trial. And four people raised their hands. And so that night they came over to my house. We sat around my kitchen table. We started going through the police reports, started digging into the case. And that night for me, the Innocence Project was born. It was already a concept that had been for a few years existing in New York City and a couple of other places, but that was my first night in the innocence world. We then drove to Illinois that weekend to Chicago. We went to the crime scene and we immediately realized that the one eyewitness, the only person who looked out their window and said they saw this shooting, was lying, because when I stood in front of her apartment on a bright sunny day, I couldn't even see the building in the middle of the park where the shooting happened. And then when I measured it off, it was over 400 feet. And when I went back at night, there was no lighting around it. And so I knew that she was lying. We finally tracked her down, and it ended up the one person looking out their window in the city of Chicago also coincidentally was the girlfriend of the victim. And that wasn't in any police reports. Nobody knew that until we found her because there'd never been a trial. Nobody ever got questioned. There was just no due process, and no evidence was brought to light against her or in defense of her because she just never had a trial. And so, fortunately, the Illinois Supreme Court reversed her death sentence, but they wouldn't allow her to withdraw her guilty plea. So I went back into court and got in front of a new jury and pled basically for them not to execute her. And I was able to bring in a lot of mitigating circumstances, but what I wasn't allowed to do was to have the trial that I wanted to have, which is to prove that she was innocent of the facts. Fortunately, a jury sentenced her to the best sentence I could get, which was life in prison, because they only had two choices, life without parole or death. And I remember walking out of that courtroom that night, freezing cold Chicago night, and thinking, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to work with law students because I saw their growth working on this case, and I saw the only way to make them into great lawyers was for them to work on cases. You can't teach someone to be a plumber from books. You got to turn a wrench on a pipe to know how to be a plumber. And it's the same thing for lawyers. You've got to go out and do the work. And so I told my wife I was quitting my tenured faculty position and we were moving to California, and I was going to start a 501(c)(3) to get innocent people out of prison. And that's what I did 25 years ago and launched the California Innocence Project that I directed for 25 years. And we put a team together. Here's some of my staff attorneys that were there and students. And we started investigating cases of innocent people in prison. And through our work, we were able to free 40 innocent people in California. The sad thing was, though, it was never Marilyn. And I knew every time that she'd see a news article about one of my clients getting out of prison, wouldn't be her. And she was just still sitting in prison, even though she's the one who inspired me, to get into this work. And I kept arguing her case. And here's a little video that's about my kind of last ditch effort in the case, where I filed a petition in the United Nations to declare her innocent, and really to declare that the Chicago criminal justice system was operating in violation of basic international human rights. Here's a little video of that. And you'll see me carrying the document to court.
I am getting ready to go over to the United Nations to file the petition on the Marilyn Malero case. This is, probably my last legal option in the case. I've been working on it for 20 years. I've lost in state court. I've lost in federal court. I've lost multiple clemency petitions in front of the Illinois governor, and I was denied review by the United States Supreme Court. So what I'm asking the United Nations to find is that that the state of Illinois violated Maryland's human rights, and that by sentencing someone to death without proper counsel, based upon a plea bargain where there was no investigation, that kind of system is just a violation of human rights. So here I go.
So I'm actually carrying her petition to the United Nations. And when you see the amount of paper I'm carrying, you'll get a sense of how much work goes into these cases. And those cops aren't there for me. I'm okay.
Have you ever seen a one-legged dog making his way down the street? Ever seen a one-legged dog? Then you seen me. Then you seen me. Come and stand at the door. You seen me. You always leave with less than I had before. You seen me, but I make you smile when the blood hits the floor.
Everything goes.
Friend.
So that petition has still not been ruled on. I filed it 10 years ago. It's very hard to get the United Nations to rule against the United States. But fortunately, I was able to ultimately get Marilyn's conviction reversed and freed. And here I am with her having dinner after working on the case nearly 30 years. When I started the case, I was 29 years old. When I finished the case, I was 58. When I started the case, she was 21 years old. And when I finished, she was in her 50s as well. And it just, this work is long and hard, and it's not for everybody. But so the first chapter of my book is called, You Hired the Wrong Lawyer. Because what happened with Marilyn is she had a great public defender, and then who'd had hundreds of trials, a woman who was highly competent. And her friend said, you don't want to have a public defender, you want to have a private lawyer. So they hire some guy in the neighborhood who's got a little office. He doesn't know what he's doing. They give him $10,000 and he enters a plea of guilty, and she gets the death penalty. And so in the first chapter of my book, I try to educate people about the difference between public defenders, private lawyers, court-appointed attorneys, and to give people a sense of how do you get a good lawyer, because it's not necessarily the person who's got the most bus stops and the most billboards along the highway and the biggest ad in the back of the yellow pages. It's not how you find good lawyers. And then the second chapter, I get into this interesting phenomenon that I had always practiced in big cities before I came to California. But when I moved to California, all of a sudden I found myself taking these cases out in these small desert towns. And quite frankly, the further from the water I got, the weirder it seemed to get. Those little towns and those criminal investigations, a lot of times they don't have the resources and they don't do a very good job. And it's an interesting paradigm that I find that most wrongful convictions either come from urban areas or rural areas, not suburban areas. Because in the rural areas, they don't have the resources or the experience to process crime scenes often, which is what happened to my client, Bill Richards, who came home and found his wife beaten to death, that the police who came just didn't know what they were doing because they weren't used to dealing with homicide cases. So they contaminated the entire crime scene. And then it took, 15 years to ultimately free him. He spent 20 years in prison. I worked on the case for 15 years because everything was contaminated. And so it was very difficult to do any DNA testing. And then you see the opposite happen in the city where there's over-policing. And over-policing also leads to wrongful convictions, where you see groups of kids who are rounded up in neighborhoods and all accused of drug dealing. And some of those kids might just be hanging out on a street corner, but they're around other kids who are involved in those activities. And that over-policing we see particularly in Los Angeles leads to a lot of wrongful convictions. So the best place to live, the moral of the story is, live in the suburbs. In chapter 3, I don't want to scare people off living with other people they're in a relationship with, but as I often say, that if you live with someone you're in a relationship with, you both have increased your chances of being murdered and increased your chance of being wrongfully convicted of murder. Because when you look across the pillow at that other person, if you do ever get murdered, that will most likely be the person who does it. And that's because the sad reality in the United States is that more than 50% of homicides are domestic. And so the partners are always suspects. And sometimes it's obvious who did it. Sometimes the partner has a great alibi and it's obvious they didn't do it. Other times it's not that obvious. And then sometimes that train runs out of control and you get a wrongful conviction. That's exactly what happened to my client, Kimberly Long, who came home and found her boyfriend beaten to death. And she had the unfortunate situation that she'd been out at the bars earlier and publicly got in an argument with him and left with another guy. And so now they have motive. She comes home, they have opportunity. Now they're far down the road towards a wrongful conviction. And here's what happened to Kimberly.
Oh, she was a good girl.
Blonde-haired, gorgeous child.
She was always happy.
Then she grew up into a beautiful young girl.
A beautiful young girl who became a nurse.
She cares about people. She wants to help.
And a mother of 2 children.
We were just lucky parents. Always thought, well, my God, things couldn't get any better.
Then, without warning, their lives turned upside down.
October 6, 2003, everything stopped.
It was about an hour before midnight when Oswaldo Conde, also known as Ozzy, and his live-in girlfriend, Kimberly Long, got into a heated argument after a long day and night of bar hopping with friends. Long, according to court records, left with a male friend. Sometime between 1:30 and 2 in the morning, the exact time is in dispute, the friend gave Long a ride home. Kimberly Long says she walked into the home she shared with Conde to find blood splattered in the living room and Conde's bloody body on the sofa. He had been beaten to death. Court records show Long called 911 at 2:09 that morning.
This crime scene was covered in blood. It was a very violent murder, and there's no way that the person who committed this murder wouldn't have been covered in blood, and Kimberly had no blood on her.
Justin Brooks is the director of the California Innocence Project at the Western School of Law in San Diego.
This is one of those classic cases where the person who finds the dead person ends up becoming a suspect.
Brooks is now representing Long. Her first trial ended in a mistrial. 9 jurors had voted not guilty, and 3 had voted guilty. When she was tried a second time, that jury convicted her. At her sentencing, the judge who tried the case, Judge Patrick Majors, said, "If the court would have heard the evidence in this case, I would have found the defendant not guilty."
Her case was paper thin when it went to trial, and now when you consider what we know since then, it's absolutely a certainty that she's innocent.
Brooks says there is new evidence pointing to Long's innocence, including DNA found on a cigarette that puts an unknown person at the scene of the crime.
And there's some significant evidence that Ozzy was dead long before Kimberly came home. But that wasn't developed sufficiently, and Kimberly ends up in this prison.
Kimberly Long agreed to speak to us on camera, but the State Department of Corrections would not allow our cameras inside the prison. So instead, we spoke to her with the help of a prison telephone. What do you want people to know about your case?
That I'm actually innocent. That if you were to sit down and actually look at my case, that there's nothing that points to me killing Ozzy. I'm actually factually innocent. That's what I want people to know. And that this can happen to anybody.
Brooks says the Innocence Project is petitioning the California Supreme Court to get the case reopened, and he has petitioned the governor for clemency.
The governor doesn't even have to declare she's innocent. He's just got to say, we looked at the case is thin, there's some evidence of innocence, she served time in prison, and she should be granted clemency.
Do you believe you will one day walk out of there an exonerated woman?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think about it all the time. That's what I do think about. I have these whole scenarios on how it's going to happen. Who's going to be there and what I'm going to say.
Kimberly Long's parents say this photo taken just 2 months before she went to prison, captures the essence of their dreams, with Kimberly hands at the wheel, navigating into open water.
Our daughter will come home.
And justice will be served.
You betcha. True justice.
In Corona, Randy Page, CBS 2 News.
Well, the good news is she did come home. She actually lives in my neighborhood now. And a few months ago, I had the pleasure of conducting her wedding ceremony on my back porch with her fiance, which was a happy ending. In the next chapter, I get into the problem of bad identifications. And the bottom line is people look like other people in the world. And the combination of bad memories and bad police processes for doing identification procedures have led to a lot of wrongful convictions, a lot of them. This might be the leading cause of wrongful conviction. And it's fundamentally because there's a huge disconnect between the actual quality of an ID and how much weight we should put on it. The bottom line is when someone walks into court and says, I'm 100% sure that person did it, that's enough to get people wrongfully convicted. And I've got a lot of examples just from my own casework. This is the lineup in the Malero case. I love this photo because whenever I ask people, who do you think in this photo is not concerned about a murder charge, is not nervous? Everybody always says this woman because she's smiling. She's actually laughing. This woman's also smiling. This woman is smiling. My client is scared to death because she's been dragged into a lineup and doesn't know what's going on. And this is the actual murderer in the case, Jackie Montanez. And the amount of non-verbal communication we do as human beings distorts these processes profoundly because people confuse fear with guilt. But they don't confuse when someone's having a good time and is relaxed. Those are the people that they eliminate. So first of all, I've got huge problems with almost every type of identification procedure, but even when they're done well, there's problems with them. And an example is my client, Uriah Courtney. He got convicted of sexually assaulting a 16-year-old girl here in San Diego. It was a horrible case with this girl's walking down the street and a guy in a truck grabs her, pulls her behind a bush, and sexually assaults her. The police then search the neighborhood looking for this truck based on her drawing of it. And this is a drawing of the suspect done by the 16-year-old girl. Now take a good look at this drawing, and you'll see there's not much detail to it. The only thing she remembers is it's a guy with a goatee. Like he probably had eyebrows, he probably had ears, but you know, it's a horrible situation she was in. The guy rubs his face up against her, so the one thing she remembered was it was a man with a goatee. Then when the police go, they go and search the neighborhood, they find a similar truck. That's my client's father-in-law's. And then they do this photo array to make the identification. Now, what's wrong with this photo array? It's very basic. The only feature we're looking for is a guy with a goatee, and yet number one has no facial hair. Number two has no facial hair. Number three is a little Scooby-Doo thing going on down here. Number four, my client's got the exact goatee. Number five, nothing. And number six has a little separated mustache a little bit down there. He's the only one who matches the only feature that the victim has articulated. So obviously she's going to pick him, and she does. And he gets a long prison sentence. So we then petition the court to DNA test the victim's clothing. We find male pattern DNA everywhere we look on the clothing that doesn't match our client. Now that's good evidence, but it's not great evidence. It's not enough to reverse a wrongful conviction because everybody picks up transfer DNA all the time off chairs, off people coughing. We all have DNA from other people on our clothes. But we have this miracle called the DNA data bank. And on the day we took that profile and ran it, there were more than 10.5 million profiles in the data bank. And the data bank is from the entire country, not from California, not from San Diego, not from La Mesa where this happened, but the entire country. And only one person came back with a direct hit. And that's this guy. And this guy lived in the neighborhood, had prior sexual assaults, and look at him next to my client. She actually didn't do a terrible job. They're both white males, late 20s, big foreheads, dark eyebrows. fairly similar looking guys. But that's why the title of my chapter in my book is "You Look Like Other People in the World" is enough to get you wrongfully convicted. So we're able to prove that it was that guy on the left. Also interesting, his mugshot, no goatee. Because when he got arrested on the prior offenses, he didn't have a goatee at that time, which is why facial hair is about the worst identifying feature because it can come and go in the course of 10 minutes. And yet that's what they relied on, and that's what led them to my client. And here he is with his parents after 7 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. My client, Jason Kindle, he was identified based on his voice because the robber wore a mask. And an officer literally used his name to one of the employees, said, "Did it sound like Jason?" And an employee said, "Yeah, it did." And he gets convicted based on his voice. We were able to prove the actual robber was 6 inches taller because we got a video of the robbery and used the height of the door to calculate the height of the robber. And there he is with his mom after 4 years in prison on the day we walked him out. Derek Harris, we so much convinced the district attorney of Los Angeles that he was innocent. Here she is posing for a picture with him at court right after we got him out. And I'm not talking a district attorney, I'm talking that was Jackie Lacey, the district attorney of Los Angeles County. Bad ID. And you're going to notice, like Derek, most of the people we've exonerated on bad IDs are people of color because those identifications are the worst ones. Cross-racial IDs of people of color, I have almost no confidence in whatsoever. People just are not good at identifying people not of their own race, particularly if they have limited exposure to people not of their race. So if, when you're a child, mom's white, dad's white, all the siblings are white, and that's all babies see, as they're developing their facial recognition software, they're not good then for the rest of their life at identifying people who don't look like their family and the people around them. And it's not, it's not racist. It's about race and something we should discuss. It's like one of the worst things I hear people say is, "I don't see color. I don't see race." Well, that's just denial because we do all see race. We do all see colors. There are cultural distinctions. And a lot of that thinking leads to wrongful convictions. Rafael Madrigal was a cross-racial ID. He's a Latino guy. He was identified by a white woman. He was identified on a photo taken when he was a teenager, even though he was almost 30 at the time of the crime. And he had the best alibi I've ever seen. He was working on the line in a factory at the time the shooting happened, 30 miles away, that there was no connection to him. And based on that single photo ID that was cross-racial of an old photo, he went to prison for 9 years until we were able to prove definitively that he was at work. Adam Riojas was another cross-racial ID. Again, it's 2 white women in that circumstance. He's a Latino guy, 13 years in prison. He's now minister of a church in San Diego after 13 years in prison for murder that he didn't do. Guy Miles, another cross-racial ID. 2 white bank tellers in Orange County identified him. He'd never even been to Orange County. At the time of the crime, he was in Las Vegas, and yet he still got identified and still got convicted. And I want to show you a little video of the night I was able to bring him home. It gives you a little glimpse into, how powerful this work is. And you can see on my face how exhausted you get doing this work, but the moments like this are so rare that they're incredible. In the beginning of the video, he's telling his daughter he's coming home. And then you'll see when he goes to his house, we didn't even tell his parents he was coming home that night, and see their reaction.
I am home, baby girl. I am home. Justin is right here. He's right here. He's not lying. We're heading home and this nightmare is over. I mean, finally, this 18-year nightmare is over for Guy and his family. They've been supporting him the whole time. They don't actually know he's coming home tonight, but we're going to bring him home right now to him. And it's just a huge relief for the California Innocence Project. to be done with this case and bring him home. We've been waiting a long time. Oh man. Wow.
See all these people right here, been in my corner since day one. Never, not one bit. They knew I was innocent going in. They know I'm innocent coming out.
Such a sweet man. That video still chokes me up every time I've seen it. I've seen it a lot of times. And he's doing great. He's living in Texas. He's got a shop where he soups up motorcycles. He's living. Not one woman, not two women, three separate women identified our client, Luis Vargas, as the man who raped them. All three women were wrong. We were able to link those rapes with 30 other rapes that had occurred in Los Angeles in the same area with the same MO, exactly the same. And when we presented that evidence to Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, they realized the mistake that they'd made, and we pretty much immediately got him out of prison. And this is the moment the judge's telling him he's coming home after 17 years. Reggie Cole, another cross-racial bad ID, 17 years in prison. Alex Torres, another bad ID case, 21 years in prison. Tim Atkins, 23 years in prison, another cross-racial ID, a Latino woman who identified Tim as her attacker, went to prison when he was 17. On this day that we're bringing him home, he's 40. Quentin Morris, another cross-racial bad ID, 27 years in prison. Rolling Adams, another bad ID, 28 years in prison. And these are just our cases. Every innocence organization on the planet has a stack of these bad ID cases. Got Glenn Boyd, 28 years in prison, bad ID. And Gerardo Cabanillas, which was the last one we freed on a bad ID case, 28 years in prison. Then the next chapter, I talk about false confessions. And this is an interesting area because a lot of people believe they don't exist. And there's a lot of people who think they would never confess to a crime they didn't commit. But most of those people have never spent 12, 13, 14 hours with a homicide detective in a small room overnight, being told lies, being threatened, being cajoled. And often people just get worn down. And a lot of times people just get angry and say, okay, whatever, I did it, because they just want to get out of that room. But the truth is, we now know innocent people confess, like Amanda Knox. And we know that 13% of wrongful convictions are attributed to false confessions, meaning 13% of now the thousands of people we've walked out of prison in the United States through the work of all the innocence organizations, conviction review units, and private attorneys that work on those cases. 13% of those people confess to those crimes that they didn't commit. And it's a long explanation as to why those things happen, but a lot of it's rooted in what's called the Reid method, which is what police officers use to get confessions. And fundamentally, it's not about getting the truth. It's about getting confirmation of a narrative that the police already have. And they spend all their time trying to get you to agree to that narrative. That's a very different process than trying to get the truth. Baby death cases are the saddest, most difficult cases I've handled in my career. We could spend hours talking about this, but a lot of them come down to simply the bad shaken baby syndrome cases, where doctors are trained in medical school that when they see these three symptoms, subdural hematomas, retinal hemorrhaging, and cerebral edemas, they diagnose it as an abuse case. But we now know all those things on the right side of the screen also cause those three symptoms. And lots of people are born with the triad of symptoms, but then they dissipate after a few weeks and they go on to good lives. But other babies, they have those symptoms, but they're subdural, so they don't see them in the hospital. They then go home, maybe fall off a changing table. Now the parents go back to the emergency room, their baby dies, and now they do a CAT scan or an X-ray and they find actual injuries from birth and think those are abuse injuries. And I'm not denying that kids aren't abused, that sometimes these are murders, but sometimes they're not. And they're very difficult to sort through and find those cases. But here's a few that the California Innocence Project, we were successful in freeing. Ken Marsh, who spent 20 years in prison for the death of his girlfriend's baby. She's standing there next to him, the woman with the red hair. And for 20 years, she said, baby fell off the couch, and no one would listen. And we were able to prove it eventually. Suzanne Johnson, 21 years in prison in a baby death case, the woman with the gray hair there. Just amazing that we kept her in prison until she was very old. Alan Jimenez, 24 years in prison, a local San Diegan, for the death of his daughter, totally innocent. And Matt and Grace Hong was probably the strangest case I ever worked on in the Middle East. It's too complex to even explain, but if you ever want to Google an interesting story, you can check that one out. Then we've got all the bad sciences. A lot of our new sciences are proving our old sciences to be flawed. For example, we now know a lot about arson science we didn't know in the past. And my client, Joanne Park, spent 29 years in prison due to a misdiagnosis that an accidental fire was intentionally started. And we're learning a lot about fire science now and looking at a lot of old cases. But there's forensic odontology, which is bite mark evidence, which is basically proven to be junk science. There is hair fiber analysis, which we've proven to be junk science. There's problems with fingerprinting if it's not done properly. There's problems with DNA. If DNA is only as good as the people who collect the biological material, the people who test it, and the people who read the results. And mistakes can happen all along that way. So even though DNA is the gold standard of science, if it's not done right, mistakes are made. So there's lots of problems with science. Fortunately, again, I also got to marry one of my clients. This is Joanne Parks. I was able to marry her to her girlfriend that she met in prison. And it was maybe the most interesting wedding I've ever, not just officiated, but ever been to. It was mostly lawyers and people released from prison. Not all that were innocent, but it was a very lively crowd. Then California leads the nation in bad sex abuse cases against children. In fact, California is home to the most expensive trial in the history of the United States, the McMartin preschool trial, where they excavated an entire neighborhood in Los Angeles looking for these underground caverns where allegedly all this sex abuse happened. And they learned later that none of it had ever happened. And it was just the children were interviewed in such inappropriate ways that they were fed information that they parroted back. And these are very hard cases to figure out who's innocent and who's guilty, because again, child molestation does happen. And people write me letters saying they would never do it. They're a teacher, they're a priest. Well, that's not really a defense. So it's very hard to pierce through these cases, but one that we did successfully win was a John Stoll case. He spent 20 years in prison, totally innocent, and all the children came forward years later and it said it never happened, that the whole thing was completely fabricated. And there's a movie about that case called Witch Hunt. Then you're poor and or a person of color. And again, I could talk about this topic for hours, but the bottom line is that poor people and people of color do not do as well in the criminal justice system as people with money and white people. All the statistics show it. All the statistics show that race of the victim is a very driving fact in criminal cases, and it's no different in wrongful convictions. You're more likely to be wrongfully convicted if your victim is white in a case. There'll be more focus, more pressure to close the case. And if you just pay attention to the news, you see this every night. That, there's even now a thing called white women syndrome. That's when a white woman disappears, it's a major news story. And if that white woman shows up dead, now it's a bigger news story. And now that'll be a death penalty case. And, those cases drive forward in a way that other cases don't. And there's a great study I talk about in my book where They actually used virtual reality to have people watch different trials, and all they changed was the race of the defendant and the race of the victims, and we're getting totally different verdicts and totally different sentences based on race. And it's sort of the challenge of this generation to deal with implicit bias, where the challenge of past generations was to get rid of explicit bias. So it's hard now to find racist laws on their surface when you read them, right? There's still some out there. I'm not denying that. But we spent a couple hundred years trying to get rid of, bias within the actual wording of the law. But that doesn't get rid of all the implicit bias of how it's applied to people, because people make decisions and people are biased. And the first step is to be aware of that. And I'm not sure we're there yet. One of the most famous cases of racism was Reuben Hurricane Carter. He was one of the people who inspired me to get into this work. He was a world champion boxer who was basically just convicted because he was black and in the neighborhood. And there's a great movie about that too called The Hurricane, starring Denzel Washington. That's worth checking out. And then finally, somebody lies about you. Simple lies. We have all these sophisticated reasons for wrongful convictions, but sometimes it's just a lie. And sometimes that lie's by the police. Sometimes it's by a witness. Lies lead to bad results, especially when it's combined with bad lawyering and not, good procedures. And a good case about that is my client, Brian Banks, who's, my most famous client because he went on to play in the NFL. And here's a little bit of his story.
We're going to start here with a story that reads like a movie. It's about a young guy with a promising NFL career derailed by a prison sentence for a crime he did not commit.
Yeah, it took him years to just clear his name, and now he's getting a second chance to pursue his dream. Sports anchor Rob Powers from our New York City affiliate WABC is here with more. So many people rooting for this guy.
Really a fascinating story. It's hard not to root for him. The National Football League preseason, it can drag on, but at least one player is enjoying every minute of it. The NFL has quarterbacks, halfbacks, and fullbacks, and this preseason, one very important comeback. 28-year-old Atlanta Falcon linebacker rookie Brian Banks is one step closer to making his dream a reality after taking to the gridiron against the Cincinnati Bengals this week. Nice job getting off a block and making a play.
It's still one of those situations where, it happened. Now it's just replaying in my head.
But this is no ordinary rookie. Banks joined the Falcons after spending 5 years in jail and 5 on parole. Why? He was wrongly convicted of raping a high school classmate. In May 2012, justice was served. The verdict for Banks overturned. The new ruling, not guilty.
Well, people's motion to dismiss this case pursuant to Section 1385 may not ever get the answers as to why I was supposed to go through what I went through. But I know that I'm here today and I remain unbroken.
And you look at the NFL right now with all the stories that are out there, the arrests, the Aaron Hernandez saga that's played out in front of us in the media, based on the hope that he has shown all of us. I wouldn't bet against Brian Banks.
Before the charges, Banks was a high school football star headed to the University of Southern California on a full scholarship to play for one of college football's best teams. But now what's in the past is in the past.
I will take this opportunity and be the best person that I can be in this world and to show people that no matter what you go through, there is light at the tunnel.
The truth is that Brian committed no crime that day, that he's a strong young man with an amazing future, and we want to get him back on track.
And back on track he is. Banks signed with the Falcons in April and picked up 2 tackles in Thursday's game.
Definitely one of the best moments of my life.
It really is.
And it's one of the best moments for me too. It's amazing to go through this whole process with a client from their lowest low and then find yourself sitting in an NFL stadium on Monday Night Football. And as soon as he got on the field, immediately had 2 tackles, like he's waited his whole life to do that, which he had. And if you want to check out, there's also a Brian Banks movie that's on HBO this month, Netflix outside the US. And then the last thing I want to show you is, my client, Mike Hanline, walking out of prison after 36 years. 36 years in prison, which is the longest. At the time he walked out, it was the longest in the history of California. And with every one of my clients, I say, where do you want to go eat? Because there's nothing better than that first meal with them. And it's almost always surf and turf. It's almost always expensive. But Mike said, I've been seeing these Carl's Jr. ads for years. I'd really like to check that place out. And I was like, dude, I can definitely take you to Carl's Jr. So here's Mike's trip to Carl's Jr.
Today is the day we are finally getting the first of the California 12 out of prison.
Yeah.
Oh, my. That's kind of hard. It feels like I'm on the front of a rocket ship going through, yeah, just
Uncharted territory.
yeah, just an incredible rush. Doesn't seem, I guess, actually real yet. Sure, not too big. Have the bacon on it. What they call it?
The Mile High, right there. Mile High bacon cheeseburger.
Please.
Want to make it a combo too? Yeah, make it a combo. Fries and drink. Fries and drink. Want to make it a large? Make it a large. Third or half pound?
Half
pound.
Let's go as big as they go.
That's your great respect.
You could.
Wow, that's what meat tastes like, huh? The commercial does it justice.
So we put that video on YouTube and it immediately went viral and started having millions and millions of hits. So we tweeted to Carl's Jr., hey, how about hooking up Mike Hanline for all this free advertising? And they ended up tweeting back free food for Mike Hanline for a year, which was very nice. Not fantastic for his health, but to eat there every day for a year. But it's such a powerful video. I always wonder why, it resonated with so many people. And for me, I think I look at it a little different than most people. To me, it's both happy and sad to see how difficult it is for him to order in a restaurant or do a lot of things. Even when he went over to the ice machine, he says, can I just get my own soda? And I was remembering in the 1970s, you couldn't just get your own soda and they didn't know the ice machine worked. There's tremendous challenges for people when they come out of prison. And we don't do a great job of while they're in of, assisting them in those transitions. So if you're interested in checking out my book, there's a little QR code here for it. It's available where books are sold. If you want to see my daily rants on every form of social media, I'm there and I am heavily ranting. So happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Yes, thank you. We would love to open the floor up to questions. You can either text them in the chat or unmute yourself. If anyone has any questions, we have Javier. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. My question, Mr. Brooks, is, and just hypothetically, if I'm working and I have somebody in prison and you called me because your people worked the file, I would look very quickly at, do I have somebody innocent there? And my question is, with your reputation, how come it still takes so long to get somebody out of prison when you guys have work to find out if they are innocent? You just need the bureaucracy of it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. There's no reason this stuff should take as long as it does. in some DA's offices, like in San Diego, I can sit down with a district attorney and review a case, and we've had cases resolved in matters of months. But that takes that kind of cooperation. Places like San Bernardino, places like Riverside, a lot of these desert counties, they fight us on everything. They fight us on access to the evidence room. I had to litigate whether DNA was a valid science in San Bernardino. Then you get through the habeas hearing, and that can be a year of litigation. And then they appeal the results of that. And then we take that all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And then in some cases, we win everything, and then they refile charges. So prosecutors have learned there's kind of two roads they can go with these cases. Either cooperate with innocence organizations, and then we can have a nice press conference and all sing kumbaya and say, well, the right result happened. And I think the smart ones do that, and the more ethical ones, quite frankly. But then there's other ones that are just in deep denial about these mistakes, and they just fight and fight and fight and fight and feel okay about that. Because I think it's very hard psychologically for people to think that they were a lawyer on a wrongful conviction. And so I've gotten better at getting cooperation over the last 25 years. I think when I was a young lawyer, I wasn't so good at it. I would just get really angry and in their face, and didn't made me feel good, but didn't really move the ball. And yeah, so that's why it takes so long, and it should absolutely not take that long. Thank you, Javier.
Yeah, thank you. Just before we are out of time here, I wanted to quickly share just a little overview of information. If you would like to learn more from Professor Brooks in our online LLM US program, he is a professor in our program, which is, yeah, like I said, offered online. It's a great way to get on the road towards California bar certification, learn more about the US legal system. If you're interested in any cross-border issues, this is a great program to learn more and deepen your area of expertise on US law. Learn from amazing professors like Dr. Brooks. Please feel free to scan the QR code, set up a meeting with me to talk about that. Should you be interested, share with your family and friends, and we hope to see you here again at one of our talks or in our program to learn more about our legal system and the ways we can collectively improve it. Thank you so much, Justin, for joining us, for sharing your time and expertise. Thank you to everyone who attended, and we hope to see you again soon.